So welcome back to those who've been here before, and we have a few new faces. So thanks for joining. As a reminder, this is a recorded session. So if you don't want kind of your presence known, stay on mute, keep your camera off. If you would love for this to be as conversational as possible. So please jump in, interrupt. It's not an interruption, it's actually an enhancement if you chime in, with questions. For those that are kind of new to the program, it's mostly Morningstar oriented thought leaders, but we of course have a handful of industry gurus that are also joining for the book club. Tao is traveling today, so if you do have technical issues, the best thing to do is email Spencer, whose email address is there. Compliance would like me to lead off with the idea that this is not advice, which again, I find so odd because we're trying to tell you how to provide optimal advice. In terms of where we are, we're in part one of the 3-part book. We're in the 2/3 of the way, in my opinion, through chapter 3. When we were last on, we talked about kind of the first 3 investor preferences, and Paul had just talked about kind of incorporating uncertainty and risk tolerance into the problem, as well as talking kind of about the Levy-Markowitz utility function. And I think we're going to start off with heading into our bequest-oriented parameters. And Paul, maybe I'll pause real quick and say if there's any questions before we get going, chime in, and then I'll pass it over to you, Paul.
Okay.
All right. Paul.
All right. So we're going to move on to present our model of survival probabilities, and then we'll talk about bequests. So far in our previous meeting, we were discussing the general theory, utility theory, and we've illustrated it where there are basically two things that a person might combine into a bundle, and they would have preferences over those as determined by their utility function. So the first illustration was pizza and beer. Then we moved on to consumption today versus consumption a year from now, and then we talked about uncertainty by talking about consumption in up markets versus consumption in down markets, and the assumption that there are complete markets for contingent claims. And now we're going to move on to the next element, which is about mortality or longevity, however you look at it. So people, have lived over some period of time, and then what we need to come up with is a way of saying what's the probability of that person being alive at each and every possible year in the future. And we're using a model that's attributed to Benjamin Gompertz, who, as you can see, lived in the 19th century, and he discovered this relationship that we're going to be talking about, and it was eventually put into an equation. And this approach that we're using, we're really taking a page from the works of Moshe Milevsky at York University here in Toronto. And the nice thing about this model is that it's very parsimonious, and it actually gives fairly accurate measure of survival probability. So 3 bits of information then. One is depends upon the person's current age. It's going to determine the probability that they're going to be alive at future ages. Then there's this parameter M, which is the mode of the distribution of the age of death. So it's a kind of a measure of central tendency, but it's not a mean or a median. It's actually a mode here, and that kind of is a way of modeling, a person's life expectancy. And then number three is there's another parameter called B, which is basically it's a dispersion parameter. It plays a role like a standard deviation does in a normal distribution. It's a kind of a this measure of dispersion around that mode of death, that mode of the year of death. Okay, so we can move on to it. Just some notation here. So the notation here we use is the lower rate Q, meaning survival probability, from T to V, meaning given that the person is alive in year T, what's the probability that they're going to be alive in TV? We can also then, from that, derive what we call a joint survival probability, which is the probability that at least one uh, member of a couple is alive. So that can be modeled as well. Okay, so here's a graph of it. Now the appendix actually gets into the math behind what's in this graph, but you can see first of all that the survival probabilities at each and every year from in the future for both males and females, and for females it's higher than males. That's kind of reflects the fact that women generally have higher survival rates than men do. And then the joint one, well, because it's joint, because it's at least one person being alive. The probability of at least one person being alive out of two people is a lot higher than the probability of any one person being alive. Okay, then with the same thing here, but this time we're expressing it as the probability of dying in a given year, and you can see that has kind of the shape you would expect, that it's rising, it reaches a top, and then it comes down again, and again you can see how much more the longevity of females is higher than longevity of males, and of course how much a great deal higher is probability. The probability of death in this context for a couple means it's the event when the second person in the couple dies. So one person dies, the second person continues to live on for a while, and then finally the second person dies, and that kind of, you can see how that just pushes the whole curve. Okay. Now this is how we adjust for life expectancy. So in our in our fictional investor is Isabella, who's working with a fictional planner, Paula. As Paula is, interviewing Isabella and asking about her family history, she learns that there's a lot of longevity in Isabella's family, and since longevity does tend to be something inherited, uh, Paula wants to adjust the model in order to raise the life expectancy. So we took the graph we just had on the probability of death, a probability of death in a given year, and what we show here is that the green curve, Isabella, is to the right of just a generic 25-year-old female. So the model has a lot of flexibility in that. You can personalize it. Okay. All right. Now here we're getting into a little math here. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to come up with a measure of the utility over a person's life. So this here is basically a lifetime, what we would call a lifetime utility function, and it's a summation of 3 bits. So the first bit is the probability of survival, which we just discussed. The second bit is the time value discount, which is discount. This utility is going to be discounted by by the subjective discount rate. So the more impatient the person is, the higher this row is, and the more future utility is discounted. And then this consumption function over here, which mathematically has the same form as a constant relative risk aversion function, but it's not risk here really. It's a this is really about what we call this elasticity of intertemporal substitution. It's how flexible the person is with respect to consumption in one period versus consumption in another period. Okay, let's go on.
Well, Paul, I was going to just interject just
Yeah.
temporarily.
Yes.
So just for people that are following along, we're going as we move kind of forward with whether it's chapter 4, 5, and 6, anything related to kind of our life cycle models. You're going to be seeing an equation very much like 3.9 here with typically the 3 bits, and then you're getting to see some of our preference parameters is often as subscripts or superscripts, where the utility that is getting derived is based on the investor's preferences. Again, so just there's many areas in which this will be, I'm going to say, personalized. And then if we go, I'm not actually going to go back, but Paul, just a second ago, you were talking about Gompertz and the ability to kind of create a custom schedule of the probability of surviving to a given age for a given person. And we saw that Isabella, whose, I guess, grandmother and other, relatives have all lived very long lives. And so in terms of trying to determine what is the optimal advice for somebody like Isabella, we want to be able to customize that based on not only her preferences, but also that unique knowledge that Isabella brings to the table around the idea that she's probably, at least probabilistically speaking, going to live longer than the average female of her age. And now I'll move on unless somebody else wants to interject anything.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take that lifetime level of utility and we're going to express it in terms of a level, a constant level of consumption year in and year out. So if instead of getting, let's say, this time varying schedule of consumption, if instead we were to replace that by by one number, just the level of consumption in each and every period, what level of consumption would do that? And that's what we're going to solve here for. And so that's our C hat here, basically. Okay, now we're going to do kind of this next step. In this next step, what we're going to do is the way that we approach modeling, uncertainty is that we use Monte Carlo simulation. And in each of our Monte Carlo trials, which is within each trial, we're modeling an entire person's possible lifetime. There, we can then use our constant relative risk aversion utility function, which we talked about last time, except here, instead of applying it to the actual level of consumption, we're applying it instead to the to this in each Monte Carlo trial to each possible the constant level of consumption under each Monte Carlo trial. And then we're going to then solve that. There's another equation we're going to solve here. And what we're going to solve for is what constant level of consumption, if it were a certain level of consumption, that is, if it were the same in every possible state of the world, or here modeled as in every Monte Carlo simulation, what number would give us the level of consumption? Now, the reason we're going through all this is because we're trying to create an input into our level of what is the optimal bequest that a person should leave. And maybe we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, this is basically another utility function. So this just says, okay, this we have 1 minus phi times this utility of of a person's that constant level of consumption. So that term represents the utility for consumption while a person's still alive. And then the second term, where we multiply by phi. Phi is basically the important, how much emphasis the investor is going to place upon leaving a bequest versus their consumption. So B here is the bequest. D is a divisor we use to just get everything into the kind of the same scale. But the important point is that there is a trade-off. So if we go to the next slide, um, the next slide is showing us what is the joint impact on our optimal bequest of on the one hand of the strength of the bequest motive, that phi, and we do that for each different level of flexibility there is between consumption and bequest. So this just shows you what that relationship is. And so if we
Paul,
go
I
to the
have a
next
quick
slide,
question.
yeah,
Would you mind going back one slide?
yeah.
So that utility function here, would this also be constant relative risk aversion that you're intending? Just trying to understand the utility calculation here a little bit further.
Oh, sure. No, it's mathematically it's the same functional form, but it's with a different parameter,
Right.
right? So it's not with the theta parameter. It's with I think it's called the not shown here, but it's this gamma parameter. This parameter, another parameter we call gamma, and that's the elasticity. Just like before, we had eta was the flexibility between consumption one period versus another. So this other parameter is the flexibility between consumption, a lifetime of consumption versus leaving a bequest. And that together with that phi parameter, which is shown here, it's just the strength of the bequest motive. The two of them together determine the level of bequest, which the next slide then shows you how how various combinations of those two parameters lead to different levels of bequest.
So Paul, assuming that we could measure gamma accurately, or that there's some method for assessing somebody's gamma, what can come out of this type of model is this is how much somebody should be leaving, and then thus what they should be consuming. Is that right?
Yeah, well, if you go to the next slide, you can see exactly what the relationship is, right? So as I so you notice in the legend of the chart, it says gamma equals 90, gamma equals 50, and so on. And so as you move, and then there's the strength of the bequest motive. So of course, as no matter what gamma is, if we would increase phi, the strength of bequest motive, the bequest would get higher and higher. But this gamma has another effect on things, which is kind of interesting because it's all the curves all pass through the same point there. But basically you can think about this gamma as determining how flat the curve is, right? So the one at the bottom, the one kind of in orange there, I let's see if I can see.
Like I would call
sorry, I
it
can't see
yellow
the
right there. I think it's
yeah,
30% is the gamma. That's the lowest gamma. Again, where
that's
the kind of the intuitive name for gamma is the flexibility of consumption versus bequest.
right. And therefore, if we set that number very low, we have low flexibility, and so we have a fairly flat curve. Whereas, of course, there's another one there, 90, the opposite extreme, which says there's a lot of flexibility, so we get it. So that curve is, pretty steep.
Spencer, maybe I should pause and say, did Paul answer your question? I know I did not.
Paul answered my question. Yes. No, that makes sense to me. The different layers. I just want to confirm what the actual utility function itself, if it was the same as before with the obviously different
Right. So I guess
parameter.
when the creation of this slide, we dropped it back in, and probably
Right.
I would say just due to laziness, didn't add the fact that it's going to follow this form, although the actual preference parameter moves
The
from
gamma, right.
theta to gamma.
Right. Okay. Makes sense to me.
Okay. Okay, so now we're introducing kind of our final element into our into our modeling of preferences, and that is the C bar. And C bar is what we call non-discretionary spending. Presumably everybody has some level of spending that they must achieve each year in order to survive. They have, they need food, they need clothing, they need housing, or whatever else. And therefore we're going to subtract that off of total consumption. So the difference is what we call discretionary consumption. So C bar includes all those basics. C might be, discretionary spending. Maybe that's money you spend on a vacation or something. But you get utility but you have the reason it's written this way is because you first have to meet your discretionary your non-discretionary requirements before you get any, like benefit from consumption, from consumption.
And maybe I'll
So
add in, just a real challenge, right? That people have, how does one really define, non-discretionary consumption versus discretionary consumption? And I think different people would define that differently. And so again, it could be, if you were really, I'd say, like very honest about how you were describing non-discretionary consumption, maybe that'd be a very low number. Where I think that a lot of us would, we would, if you're better off, you'd probably, what you'd consider to be non-discretionary might not be as non-discretionary as you'd think. But again, I would just say it is a challenge, and one where to me, it's not quite clear where to draw the line between what is truly, non-discretionary versus discretionary.
Okay, we're on to chapter 4. So basically what we're going to do in chapter 4 is we're going to introduce the concept of the economic balance sheet. And as we'll see, the economic balance sheet is really a representation of the intertemporal budget constraint. And so all the things we just talked about, consumption, discretionary consumption, non-discretionary consumption, and all the different things are going to now appear, are going to appear in the economic balance sheet. So let's kind of
And maybe
just we
can, kind of where we, I'd say, chapters 3 and 4, again, we're really putting in kind of the precursors for the actual life cycle models that will be developed in chapters 5 and 6, where 5 is deterministic, moving to chapter 6, they become stochastic. Again, and I admittedly, right, we're deep into a formula intensive session, but hopefully perhaps worth the pain.
Okay, so this is just kind of showing where we are. We've already talked about the different, the 5 preferences, and now we're going to talk about the individual's economic balance sheet, which, as you would expect, a balance sheet would contain. On the left-hand side is assets. There are basically 2 assets: financial assets and human capital. And on the right, there's liabilities, and then net worth is assets minus liabilities. So what might you include if you're preparing an economic balance sheet for somebody? Well, start with their financial assets: bank accounts, brokerage accounts, real estate, if they already own some annuities and so on. So things like that, all the things you would kind of expect, you'd find in a financial statement. But one of the really key things here is human capital, which doesn't appear on any standard balance sheet. We have to add it, and that's going to include the present value of wage income, income from a defined benefit plan, present value of income from government-sponsored social insurance, such as Social Security in the U.S. And I always want to use the term social insurance here because that's global, where Social Security is a U.S. specific form of government-sponsored social insurance. When we move over to liabilities, there's going to be the present value of non-discretionary consumption. So that's how, like Tom was just talking about, the challenge of identifying non-discretionary consumption. But once you've done that, there's a present value calculation we're going to need to do. And then there's the present value of term life insurance premiums. So that's how we bring life insurance into the balance sheet. And then the net worth must equal the present value of discretionary consumption. That there is the intertemporal budget constraint. That basically that's what it says. It says that your net worth must equal the present value of discretionary consumption.
And so, like in the pizza and beer example from chapters gone by, where the person had $20 was their budget constraint. Now we have the left-hand side of the balance sheet, financial assets plus human capital, serving as that budget constraint that must hold as one moves through life.
That's right. And budget constraints in general are always an integral part of any economic model of consumption. Okay, so here we go. This is kind of a conceptual equation. But basically the idea is conceptually the present discount value of your consumption must equal your financial wealth and your human capital. Now you say, well, wait a minute, what happened to non-discretionary consumption and liabilities? Well, if we broke that consumption out into discretionary and non-discretionary, then we can move that non-discretionary term over to the right side of the equation, and that would become liabilities. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so human capital, the present discounted value of income, here it just says labor income, but it's really of any kind of income. As we said, it's labor income when you're working, but it could be defined benefit income when you're retired. It can be social insurance when you're retired, and so on. But it's a present discounted value. Okay, so now sometimes what we need when annuities are present in the model, we do have to make a bit of an adjustment to that equation, and we have to introduce an adjusted longevity, probability of survival into the equation. But I'm not getting into that here. It gets a little complicated. But on the other hand, it kind of makes intuitive sense in that well, if I'm going to be discounting my future income then when do I need to take into account the survival probability, because I might not get that income. I have to be alive to get the income, and that's what this is taking into account. Okay. All right. Now, how do we model labor income? Well, we use a model that was introduced, I don't know how long ago at Morningstar. I don't know if Tom, if you know the history of this model at all, or
I guess in terms of like customizing it for level of education, I don't remember when that was integrated. Kind of, we call these salary curves frequently, and again, it's been at least 10 years ago that we began using salary curves. I don't know if Philip is on the call today. I didn't look at the attendees. Philip, has been doing some very interesting work that I'd say goes beyond, just kind of education level, and modeling human capital and thinking of, especially about maybe people that receive company stock in whether it's in stock options or some sort of stock units. Philip, you might actually recall when these salary curves were introduced, and maybe even put in a plug for some of the work that you're doing, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so what I recall, I remember Francisco Torralba at the time, this was probably 10 plus years ago, did work on the salary curve. It's not something that we're using explicitly in terms of modeling the shape of the distribution of somebody's wage, but we do have a paper that we're working on that we're going to put it out next month that looks at human capital at the firm level. So we developed a model that is able to effectively model the riskiness of human capital at the firm level. One of the interesting elements of that is that stock-based compensation has increased significantly over the past 2-3 decades, and so as a result of that, your human capital is more correlated with your specific company, and in some ways that creates more of a need for you to diversify that company-specific risk away. There's a great paper called the Human Capitalist paper by Andrea Eisfeld that looks at that question, and they find that I want to say a vast majority of firms today compensate their employees with stock-based compensation, and it's not just C-level executives. I think about 70 or 80% of stock-based compensation actually goes to employees below the C-suite, so to speak. And so we'll be circulating that, hopefully in a few weeks here. And so, but yeah, unfortunately, no more context on the salary curve here.
But David Blanchett, who you're on the call, I think, and maybe you're drifted away, but if you're still here, I think you were actively involved in the creation of these salary curves. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so actually Francisco was the first person to put them together, and I had updated it a few times back in the day. So it uses data over like 30 years from the IPUM's data set. So it's looking at how wages have evolved over time for males and females based on different levels of education.
And then I don't think Hal Ratner is on the call, but I think he's the one that currently updates these on our behalf. But I think I'm going to move on. But I guess the interest so at some level, right, we're calculating the capitalized value of that human capital asset. People's salaries are going to change moving forward, and again, to the degree that you can model kind of the accuracy in terms of real wage growth, you will do a better job, all else equal, creating kind of a personalized estimate of somebody's capitalized human capital value.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that are quite notable about those curves. First of all, we have four different educations. So there's a generic curve, which I guess is like if you don't know the person's education level. Then there's high school, then there's college, and then post college. People with master's, PhD degrees. What you'll notice, of course, is that within each of those four, women get paid a lot less than men do. It looks like, on average. So the data behind this, bears that out. And then you also notice that all the curves, they reach a maximum and then they start kind of going down gently in the later years. So at least, according to the data that we have, that salaries do not continuously increase throughout a person's career. They can actually take a dip. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this is we're just taking expected human capital, two versions of it. The without mortality weighting is basically if there are no annuities, and with mortality weighting if there are annuities. But what the main message here is that human capital generally declines over time. I mean, Isabella is 25. When we start off here and we've estimated her human capital, what might happen to her human capital, and you can see how it declines. We assume at 65 she's going to retire, so she no longer has, the salary from her salary curve. Now she's collecting Social Security, and so you can see it's a flatter. No, it's kind of flatter. Okay. Now, one of the things that I found was kind of a bit of a challenge was that there's a lot of discussion about the discount rate in human capital, and that discount rate, it should represent the riskiness of human capital. The problem, though, is that what I was trying to figure out was, well, what does it actually mean for human capital to be risky? What's going to be subject to variation? And so, well, my starting point was here. Basically, you create a very simple three asset class, simplified three asset class model. And the idea was to say, okay, let's use these parameters to determine what do we mean by riskiness. So the idea is that every investor should have, the riskiness of their human capital. We want to model it in terms of some kind of simple asset class model. Now, if you notice here, Isabella, we're saying that her human capital is as if it were 15% domestic stocks, 5% international, and 80% bonds. And a tenured professor. Again, this is an example really based upon the work of Moshe Milevsky. He published a book called "Are You a Stock or a Bond?" Basically, how risky is your human capital? So, a tenured professor, it's 10%. We model as 10% domestic stocks and 90% bonds. So, a tenured professor has a very, very bond-like human capital. So when we model the riskiness of a tenured professor's human capital, it should look an awful lot like bonds. And then, Tom, could you read off the stockbroker line?
30% domestic stocks, 15% international stocks, 55% bonds.
Right. So the stockbroker has a 45-55 mix. So they have a lot of risk, in their human capital. And I guess, what Philip was just saying about how much compensation now is coming in the form of company stock. That would suggest there's a lot more people now who have because human capital is a lot riskier than you might think.
And if Philip, correct us if we're wrong. I think, to me, I think we have relatively generic models here for the purposes of the book or monograph. But I think, again, the research that you're doing is, kind of at the forefront of how do you really personalize the model that you choose to use for a given person. And again, in some cases, you would use actually the employer stock as one element of a more complicated but more personalized model. And do I have that right, Philip? Maybe you've moved on, so I'll move on too.
Okay, let's move on. Anyway, this is just a graphical representation of the numbers. We wanted to kind of show this in a graph.
Sorry,
like
I think my audio was just in and out. Sorry about that. But yeah, I just wanted to confirm. I did hear your comment. My audio was not working for a minute there. So we do look at the percentage of compensation that comes from stock as one of the key variables, and then we also look at basically the credit default swap information. So when we discount human capital, so we look at stock level or company level credit default swap, and so both of these components will pick up some additional correlation. So if you're working for an energy company versus, say for a utility company that probably has less stock-based compensation and lower risk, then you'd have a different correlation to the stock market. So I just want to confirm that. So thanks, guys.
Yeah. So this is just showing graphically. You can see, the tenured professor is pretty close to the bottom of that frontier. Isabella is a little bit riskier, and then the stockbroker is, significantly riskier. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so how do you model risky income? Well, the way we do it is we create a model we call it an innovation. An innovation, I mean, it's a random variable. Its expected value is 1, and it has some standard deviation, and that standard deviation will depend upon the expected return standard deviation of the underlying models. And since it is risky, it means we can actually draw these curves, because that the first part of that curve, it is from age 25 to age 65. That looks just, that blue curve, that basically is the salary curve. But then we notice that we create these optimistic and pessimistic scenarios by looking at like the 10th and 90th percentiles of what income might be around that. And you can see it's kind of a wide range. But this really does show how risky it is, how risky it is. So I thought that was important, because if we're discounting the expected value, expected future stream of income, then when the reason we discount it at a kind of a risk adjusted rate is because of the risk. And so this shows the risk. Go to the next slide.
If you don't mind, Paul, and Dan Kemp, I'm going to put you on the spot. You had asked me some questions a while back offline, and I guess I don't know if I completely remember them. So if you could, clarify for me, that would be great. But I think you had asked some questions. Well, what happens if somebody gets injured? Maybe they decide to stop working for a couple of years. Maybe they change careers. How does the model incorporate that? I guess first I don't know, do I have your question, the essence of your kind of questions right? And then I'll let you respond to that. And then maybe Paul can say how this is kind of getting included in the distribution of incomes. But of course, one could come back and update one's information on the new career if it was one. But Dan, first, do I have your questions right?
You do. Thanks, Tom. Yes. It's more thinking about, as you say, where there are breaks in a career, which would fundamentally change that path. So you could come back and redo all the numbers. But I guess the question becomes when someone anticipates some sort of break in a career. So let's say a young couple are anticipating that one of them would take a career break to look after kids for a few years, and how you can incorporate that.
Well, I think the way it would be incorporated is you would have to put a break in that salary curve and just say, okay, so this person is, I mean, are they not working at all? So does it go to 0? I mean, or there's still some kind of compensation that they're receiving, whatever it is. Because we've assumed here basically is that everyone just follows the salary curve. But I think there are scenarios certainly where that would not be appropriate, where there'd be a break, a change in career change, or something that would have to cause you to model that.
And so in the book, we've envisioned that there would be some sort of commercial software that would make this scalable and easy to use for a financial planner. For Paul to take that break that you just described in somebody's earnings and feed that into the machinery would be, very easy. Designing commercial software, which you want to kind of enable that and allow somebody to import, if you will, or input, as it might be, a custom kind of schedule like that. That could be done. It would just be more challenging for that kind of software creation. And so, Paul, you had said move on to the next slide before I put Dan on the spot.
Okay. Well, this is just doing the same exercise, but with human capital. So again, we create these, human capital. It's because income is risky, therefore human capital is also risky. And human capital, changes from year to year in the same way that income changes from year to year by the kind of these random shocks, which I've called innovations. And here again, you've got, I guess I guess from the previous slide, we know that the optimistic and pessimistic are the 75th and 25th percentiles, and there's a median there, the 50th percentile. But again, it's the same idea that, that I think it means what, instead of sort of drawing a human capital curve, just drawing one curve, it's like you have to draw some other percentiles around that curve to capture the riskiness. Now with the non-discretionary consumption, I mean, in general, just like in principle, you could change the salary history, the anticipated salary history. You can also change the anticipated non-discretionary consumption. But here, we to keep things simple, we just kept it here. It's a constant. For the expectation is it's a constant $400,000, and then you see those 25th and 75th percentile curves around it, showing that it's risky. And then we go to the next slide.
But just I might point out, we just, again, as a reminder, we're always draw everything that we draw is in real terms or inflation adjusted terms.
Yeah. Okay. So here again, the liabilities, like the expected liabilities, decrease over time because, in the future, every year in the future, you have one less year ahead of you. So it's going to decline, but again, we can draw percentiles around that curve to represent the uncertainty.
And that is going to conclude kind of chapter 4. And I'm debating whether we should kind of move on and try to start tackling chapter 5. That was part of the kind of assigned reading. But are there any questions related to what Paul just discussed in chapter 4, maybe before we decide to plow on?
Just one question, Tom, going back to the question of the salary curves, and I saw there that obviously they are curves, so somebody peaks in salary, peaks in real terms, and then tends to fall off. And my question is that designed to be the salary journey of any one individual, so they can expect their real earnings to fall off later in their lifetime, or is it an average that represents the fact that some people are made redundant at that point in their careers and don't sort of come back into the marketplace, or retire,
Paul,
I guess.
And Paul, do you want to take that?
Well, first of all, they are, yeah, I mean, these represent averages. We're using them here to model our hypothetical individual because we're assuming that her salary is average. But maybe more David and Phil could maybe get into, why it is that, what does the decline in at the end of the curve, what's that due to? Why do we see that in the data?
And it's unclear to me if they're joined or just on mute or.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great economic. You're talking about the decline in, was it the decline in?
Well, it's just the decline in average that, so the level of salary or, compensation seems to peak. My recollection was that, maybe at 50-ish. And then as one moves closer to say 65, it trails off a bit. And again, I do think, does that, reflect, people not returning to work? Does it reflect, maybe they're not even included in the average. Maybe they're taking, lower salaries, changing to a second career that they perhaps like enjoy more than the grind, whatever the grind might be. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's my intuition as well. I remember having a conversation with Francisco about that at the time, and I think he had a similar intuition. Is it at the annual compensation level, or is it hourly wages that we're looking at? One of them would control for the amount of time work, but maybe David, if he's still on, might have a a better a better economic story around it.
Yeah, so I mean, it holds for both. I think Tom hit it where, like workforce participation just changes dramatically at older ages. You've got a lot of individuals that can actively choose to leave the workforce. Individuals may be forced to change jobs. So, while it does decline, it's not maybe as representative of all Americans working those ages because of all the embedded choices that exist. So I think it's pretty reliable up until around say age 55, but it gets very different based upon the folks who are still working at older ages. So I would say it's kind of less reliable to some extent.
And then of course, what everyone is taking as the average, or is perhaps, kind of, an input parameter. As Paul mentioned, of course, there's innovation around whatever path, somebody has chosen to reflect that, there are random events. And of course, there's a kind of a whole distribution around sort of that expected value. We're at, I guess, 7 minutes to the top of the hour. I'd rather not start into chapter 5 at this point. Again, if there's any further questions, I would say related to the material covered so far, happy to cover it. I'll be sending out, a link to the meeting afterwards. The meeting assignment, I believe, for next week should probably be, of course, chapter 5 if you didn't get to it, but then on to chapter 6 and 7. Again, I'm not quite sure that we'll make it into chapter 7, but it'd be good to be prepared to discuss that. Any more questions at this point in time? I'm going to say going and gone. And so thanks again for joining the call. We'll give you 5 minutes back, and we look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you very much.